Welcome back to On Board at the Candidates, where I'm choosing one game per round to go over to pick out the basic points and things that we can apply to our own games from these super high level games that are sometimes a little bit mysterious and don't really know what's going on. So today I chose the game of 17-year-old Gukesh against Nepo. To go over basically. Okay, so Gukesh started with d4 and Nepo responded knight f6, c4, e6, and Gukesh sort of opted to fianchetto his bishop, play g3, which is Catalan kind of structure. Now, there's a few options here for black. One is to play bishop b4 check, but Nepo opted to occupy the centre with a pawn, play d5, and Gukesh placed his bishop on this really nice long diagonal. Often in this opening, White's play is based around optimising this bishop, making the most of it, and that's where kind of the wins often come for White. So there's so many possible replies here for black. Nepo went for something fairly rare, c5. So it starts off as sort of a Catalan, and now it's prone to transposing into sort of a Queen's Gambit declined Tarrasch kind of structure. So that move's fairly rare, but fairly solid. Really challenging that centre. Gukesh replied by taking on d5, and now black has a choice, a fairly major choice early on. He can recapture with a knight or the pawn. So Nepo opted to take with the knight. Very, very solid reply, keeping the pawn structure symmetrical, or they will be symmetrical once the c and d pawns are traded off. The other option is to take with the e pawn. And now, eventually, black is likely to be left with this isolated queen pawn. If anybody watched the game round one game recap, there was an isolated queen pawn in that opening between Abasov and Nepo. So in this position, White is sort of likely to play something like knight f3, knight c6, castles, bishop here, and then after takes, we're left with an isolated queen pawn. And White's idea will be to sort of probably put a knight on d4 and swap the pieces off and eventually sort of round up this weak pawn. Black will have compensation with open lines, some nice squares potentially to put the knights on, sort of e4, c4, lots of open lines and attacking possibilities. Nepo opted to sort of take with the knight instead, and the game continued knight f3. Took on d4, sort of liquidating the centre. Castles just sort of delayed taking the pawn back. Nepo carried on with his development. Gukesh took the pawn back. This is all sort of fairly standard, normal stuff so far. Castles, knight b3 hits this bishop. Nepo did put it back on e7, very solid. I think another option is sort of putting it on b6, keeping it on this really nice long diagonal towards the king. The sort of downside of this is that potentially it can be hit with an a5 at some point or immediately, and this a pawn coming up the board works really, really well with the bishop. So working in sort of in tandem, opening up that diagonal is potentially dangerous for black. So I think Nepo's strategy so far has been to keep things really, really solid with black, so this bishop retreat is a little bit more solid. Now we reach a position where there is sort of symmetrical pawns, so we've got a and b pawns each, and then e to h, and then nothing on the c and d files. So if the pawns are all equal, the amount of space is equal for both sides. The only thing that can be different are the pieces. So if White is to claim some form of advantage, then White's pieces are going to need to be better than black. The knights are going to be about the same. There isn't, at the moment, until pawns move, there isn't any special squares anywhere for knights to occupy where they can't be hassled. The black squared bishops are about the same. They've got the same amount of scope. All the major pieces are about the same. So all of white's advantage, potential advantage, is going to be based on the fact that his light squared bishop is better than black's light squared bishop. So at the moment, black's light squared bishop can only come to one square. If he wants to increase its scope along this diagonal, he'll have to play this pawn forward. And if this pawn comes forward, then that is going to sort of weaken, well, that knight at the moment on d5. It's not possible to play this pawn forward, obviously. But it's going to be very difficult for black to achieve this e6, e5 move, and it would lead some sort of weaknesses behind as well. The other way to develop this bishop is going to be sort of playing b6. Let's just say I play here, playing something like b6. The problem with that is that there's going to be at least one move when white's bishop is not on, so black's bishop is not on this diagonal. And potentially, if white could clear this diagonal, then this bishop is going to win the rook. So tactically, it's going to be very difficult for black to achieve this b6 move. So at the moment, white can claim that he's a little bit better only because this white squared bishop is better than black's white squared bishop. It's a very minor advantage. Gukesh played e4. I personally don't really like this move. You know, we're still in theory and it's still fine, but I would much prefer to play a move like bishop d2. The reason is I want to play my knight out to c3, but I don't want to mess my pawns up. If I play knight c3, then takes, and this b pawn is going to be on this semi-open file, and it's got no friends to protect it. So it's going to be a potential weakness in the future. So prophylactically, I would like to play in this position. I would play bishop d2, saying I'm going to play knight c3 next move. So this has been played before. It's much more my style. I want to just clear this diagonal for that bishop and then try and emphasize its, you know, the positives of it. So something like takes after queen b6, play knight d4. Let's try and clear this one out of the way as well. If something like this happened, queen takes, queen takes, queen takes. Okay, we've traded a lot of pieces off, but we've emphasized the fact that our bishop is so much better than black's bishop. Black's bishop kind of has to stay on c8 now, guarding this b7 pawn, and that in turn stops the rook from getting out. So our rooks are also going to be better than black's rook. So this kind of plan, while it looks quite basic, but sometimes if you've got a piece that's better than your opponent's, trade every other piece off and it sort of highlights that weakness or that disadvantage. So bishop d2, very simple plan, but you can see sort of simple moves. If black just followed this, then white would be a lot better. Okay. Alternatively, in this position, sort of rook d8, actually there's some tactical chances. You get one piece, there's another loose piece here, and after here, then actually white has plenty of compensation, or more than enough compensation in this position for the sacrificed queen. I could get this pawn as well, so I've got my 9 points. And now this bishop is still not coming out. My bishops are good, my rooks are good. The king maybe is slightly weak. So that's a potential sort of continuation. After e4, that at least temporarily blocks in my beautiful bishop and my sole claim to an advantage, but it does sort of pose some problems to black's coordination. Where's this knight going? Okay, so it comes to b4, where it just looks a little bit clumsy and awkward for a while. Knight c3, continuing with the development. Black is a little bit behind in development, needs to catch up, still hasn't developed this queen side. Knight 8, c6. Now the problem with this is, I mean, it's a good move, but the problem is it sort of makes this knight look even more clumsy. Actually, I'm sort of semi-running out of squares for it, and I don't want to come back to this square if I get kicked. Bishop e3, carrying on with the basics, developing the pieces to nice squares, eyeing the queen side. So when bishops are sort of on diagonals next to each other, they can be particularly strong when they're pointing across the board. So queens come off. So a point to note here is that black has less space. So if we have a little look, roughly black sort of occupies the space behind this rank. White roughly occupies the space behind here. So white has a little bit of more space than black. Okay? And a rule, when you have less space, you want to swap pieces off generally. You've got less pieces to fit in your smaller space. So swapping queens off is a good idea here. And then Nepo tries to solve his issues with coordinations of these knights, this knight being on a really awkward square, by playing knight e5. It also eyes this really nice square for the knight here, and allows this knight to drop back, so it makes a lot of sense. A3 was played to kick that knight away, and now F4 was played, so gaining space. And supporting potentially e5 in the future, and already eyeing the response. So when knight c4 comes in, he was going to retreat the bishop back to c1. These moves, retreating moves, a little bit more difficult to see sometimes. We don't naturally want to go backwards. However, this is a really nice move, preserving the bishop pair. You wouldn't really want to do something like this. For starters, it's not defending this pawn, okay, so but we wouldn't want to give him the option to sort of have the bishop pair as well. So bishop c1, lovely move. The other thing to note is when you've got a bishop and a knight against each other, it's often a really nice square for a bishop is three squares in front of a knight. Okay, so if you think there's two squares in between them, and that means that this bishop sort of stops that knight coming to any square forward. Okay, so it's covering all of these squares. The bishops are really nicely placed, two squares in front of a knight, because you're controlling half of those knights' moves coming forward. Okay, so white now wants to play e5 to open up this bishop diagonal. So this explains black's move of f6. He wants to stop e5. If e5 is played now, it's sort of defended. Okay. So now this bishop has got not so many possibilities. It doesn't have this lovely diagonal to play with anymore. And Gukesh says, okay, I've provoked this weakness because actually f6 is no longer defending this pawn on e6. Okay, so when pawns go forward, they can't go back. They always leave something behind. And in this case, it's a weakness on e6. So that, combined with the fact that the bishop's diagonal is not going to be opened up again, Gukesh thought, okay, let's just reposition this bishop, the white squared bishop, onto a better square. And where could it be placed better but on c4? So how is it going to get to c4? Onto a really nice diagonal that includes the black king and the weakness on e6. So plays rook fe1. Initially you might not notice why, but it's getting out of the way so that bishop can slide back to f1 and onto that really nice diagonal. Okay, so when you're coming up with a plan yourself, you should have a look what pieces are not doing very much and try to improve them. So at the moment this knight is doing well. This knight is not so bad as well. There's not really any better prospects for this bishop, but this bishop is being lazy. It's just sat there on c8. So Nepo comes up with a plan potentially to activate this bishop. He wants to push b5 and then place the bishop on b7. So he plays rook b8. And now Gukesh carries on with his plan of bishop f1, eventually hopefully coming onto this diagonal. The knight comes back to d6, covering still the c4 square, and which explains Gukesh's next move of knight b5. So trading off this knight. So this knight gets traded off, and suddenly this c4 square is primed, ready for that bishop to be pointing at this weakness and potentially looking to play f5 in the future and winning this e6 pawn. So Gukesh has got one weakness to play with. Okay, so if you're going to, the more weaknesses in your opponent's position, the better. So Gukesh has a little bit more space. He's got one weakness to play against. Ideally, you need at least two weaknesses to play against because you can play them off against each other. If your opponent only has one, then they can focus all their attention on that and sort of make sure that you don't win it. Okay, so prophylactically, Nepo defends this e6 pawn. He plays king f7. He can see that trouble is coming for this e6 pawn, so he plays king f7. And now that this pesky knight on c4 has gone, Gukesh improves his bishop on c1. It's not doing a job anymore defending this b2 pawn, and it comes to point at that a7 pawn. Always look out for loose pieces and 1v1s. So 1v1 is what I mean is it's attacked once and defended once. Okay, so this, for example, this knight is attacked once, it's defended once. This pawn on a7 is attacked once and it's defended once. Okay, the reason that we look out for loose pieces or 1v1s, 2v2s is if you remove one defender, then obviously there's an overload there. Okay, so if we can take this knight, when they take back, this bishop can take on a7, potentially winning a pawn. So black has to guard against that. So for example, if he does something like this, then I don't know, actually eventually it doesn't quite work at the moment because of this b2 pawn is hanging. So a6 isn't absolutely necessary at the moment. If he did something just wasted time like this, then I think that white is probably just going to gain some space, improve his pieces, maybe gain some space on this side of the board, and eventually will improve his pieces enough and then attack on the queen side or the king side basically. So a6 was played, white retreated, and black gained a little bit of space on the queen side. Okay, so as we mentioned before, he wants to put this bishop from c8 onto a better square, potentially onto this diagonal, because it's not been doing anything all game so far. This b5 also takes away this really nice c4 square from white's bishop. So he wants to do that, but the problem is when pawns go forward, I've said this a number of times already, pawns go forward, they cannot go back. Okay, so when they go forward, they leave squares behind. So always, before you push a pawn, think which squares are you leaving behind and does it matter? So this pawn now, it's come to b5, it's never going to be able to defend that c5 square, it's never going to be defending that a5 square, or c6. So does it matter? Well, I would say that a5 probably doesn't matter. It's on the edge of the board. If I stick a knight there, it's on the edge of the board. Knight's on the rim of dim. However, the c5 square is a very, very nice square for a knight. It's close to the center. It's protected. It can only really be challenged by this bishop. So that is a really nice square. Nepo obviously just said didn't mind. Sometimes we have to give things up to gain things. So he wanted to gain a bit of space. Didn't want to just get slowly squashed, so he played b5. When you have less space, just swap some pieces off, and it makes sense. Rook d8, swap the pieces off, gain a little bit of space. Now white has a little bit of space, has this e6 pawn to play against. So how is he going to carry on? Well, if you're not sure, always ask yourself, are your pieces on the best squares possible? Okay, so at the moment, all the minor pieces are actually well placed, but this rook is not really doing much. So where can we put it? Makes a lot of sense to put it on an open file, D or E file. D or C file. C file, because again, as I said, always identify loose pieces. If we're looking at loose pieces in black's camp, then this knight on c6 is loose. It doesn't have any defenders, nothing looking after it. The only other piece in black's camp that is loose is the h7 pawn, which is out of our reach at the moment. So putting this rook on the c file, it improves its scope, but potentially hints at tactics along the line of, if this knight moves out of the way, we can take their knight. So for example, if I did something that's wasting time here, I can reveal the attack on this knight by taking a pawn, and then when it's taken back, I can take here. Okay, winning a pawn, and with a really nice nice position. So always identify loose pieces in your opponent's camp and set things up, basically. Okay, and so two things done in one, two things done with one move here, improving that rook position and potentially threatening that knight. Okay, so something that Nepo had to deal with. So he played bishop b6. Now this deals with the threat by highlighting a loose piece in white's camp. Okay, so white has a loose piece on e3. It's not defended, and if it was taken, then it would also come with a fork. So for example, if I did this now, then there is a fork. I'm going to lose my rook as well as the bishop on e3. So he deals with the threat tactically, and Gukesh ignites that threat, I guess. So he defends that bishop on f2, and Nepo says, okay, I've had enough of this knight. It's on a good square. Let's get rid of it. Okay, so and then Nepo plays bishop b7. So finally, this bishop has on move 27. It makes its first move onto a decent square. So the dust has settled, and now we have an imbalance in the position. So white has a little bit more space, a tiny bit more, not a lot more. But the main imbalance, as was with the last game, round 2, is that we've got bishop v knight. So if you watched the last video in round 2, Caruana had a knight and Abbasov had the bishop, and I said that basically if the knight has squares to sit on, really nice squares, then it's going to be better. Otherwise that bishop is going to be better. So who is better in this position? Are there any really nice squares for knights to sit on? So we're thinking of squares that are not able to be challenged by a pawn or a bishop, that it can sort of happily sit on, that's close to the center. So at the moment, there aren't many squares that can't be challenged by a pawn. So these ones here, but they're very, very well covered by white's bishop and king. So there's no squares at the moment for the knight. Are there any prospects in the future? Well, that's up to Gukesh's play. If he can somehow prevent the knight from getting squares, then he's going to be better. And the general plan, if you've got the bishop against the knight, so if you've got the bishop pair, your general plan is normally you want to prevent the knight from getting squares. You want to then gain space while still preventing the squares from being created. When you're gaining space, then you can provoke weaknesses. So ideally you want to provoke at least one weakness on each side of the board, and then this can be exploited by your bishop that can target both sides of the board at the same time, while the knight finds it very difficult to hop back and forth defending lots of weaknesses. So the first move here, so basically Gukesh is defending lots and lots of squares with king e3. So he's defending this e4 pawn that was loose, he's defending the d4 square, and he's defending the d2 square from a potential rook coming down as well. So it's cutting off squares from the knight and the rook while also defending this e4 square. So it's a really nice move, king e3. Nepo improves the position of his rook. And now the next part of the plan for white should be to try and gain space and exploit weaknesses, or sort of create weaknesses while gaining space, basically. So if we're gaining space, how are we going to do that? Something like b4 is an option. Okay, so cementing that bishop on c5, and another option is something like h4, followed by h5, maybe g4. You're not giving any important squares away by doing this. So that is another way of sort of trying to maximize your advantage. There's not much that black can do to respond to sort of something like h4. You can go rook d7, you can go h5, and yeah, there isn't too much that he can do about it. You have to be a little bit careful not to advance too much, because you're leaving squares behind or potential weaknesses. The other thing to bear in mind is that your opponent has a white squared bishop, so you would like your pawns ideally to be on white squares. So advancing it to h5, if your opponent sort of responds with h6, potentially many moves from now, this bishop might target this pawn at some point. Okay, so ideally you want them to be on black squares. Another option in this position for white would be to play this move, temporary pawn sacrifice of a4. Black has one weakness already, so he has this weakness on e6, and that's probably the only weakness in his camp. But at the moment, it's very difficult to target it. Would love to have a bishop on c4 that would target this point. The other thing is, if we could remove this b pawn, then the bishop simultaneously would attack two weaknesses from c4. It would have this a6 pawn and e6 pawn. And on two different sides of the board, it'd be very difficult for a knight to sort of hop back and forth and defend both of them. So a4 in this position, in a great move. Because after takes, you're just temporarily sacrificing that pawn, rook a1. It's not possible for black to hold on to that pawn. After something like here takes, I don't know, knight e7, something like this. We could actually just take this off, play e5, and then it's going to be very, very difficult for black to hang on to this pawn. If you have a little look, purposefully, all of white's pawns are on black squares, while his opponent's bishop is on a white square, and there's a number of pawns of blacks on white squares that can be targeted by white's bishop. Okay, so yeah, there's other potential continuations, but the bishop is going to look really, really nice here targeting this e6 pawn, and white would have a fairly decent advantage. What Gukesh chose to do is to swap the rooks off. Okay, so he played bishop d6 first, b6, sorry, and then swapped the rooks off. To swap it into a bishops versus knight and bishop endgame. Now at the moment, black only has one weakness. If he had two weaknesses, this would be a different story. He only has e6, so he can focus his attention on looking after this e6 pawn. The problem with swapping rooks off as well is now that the rooks are swapped off, if somehow Nepo can swap this knight for this bishop, you'd have an opposite colour bishop endgame, and he could afford to be at least one pawn down, maybe more, and it would be a fairly straightforward draw normally. Okay, so if the rooks were on, however, there are attacking possibilities with opposite colour bishops, so it's not an option to sacrifice a pawn to get into a drawn endgame. So swapping the rooks off is probably a strategic blunder. The rooks need to be on to take away this possibility from black of sacrificing a pawn and getting an opposite colour bishop endgame. And also, you do have attacking possibilities with the rooks on the boards. The rooks could have been traded off at any point, potentially. Like black is not doing anything, doesn't have a plan. So this is probably quite a big blunder by Gukesh and probably cost him the chance of winning this game. Nepo defended quite straightforwardly from this point. He only has one weakness to look after, so he played g6, bishop c5, h5, b3 was played, bishop c8. The idea is, I think he wants to put this bishop on a different diagonal now, and he does want to play e5 in a minute, and this is the part to keep a white's pawn on e4 on a white square. So at the now Nepo as black, he's got a white squared bishop. He's going to want as many of white's pawns on white squares as possible. So he's going to keep it there. So he plays e5, takes, and Gukesh has one last chance at a win. If he can create an outside pass pawn, the bishops are fantastic at supporting outside pass pawns, while the knight very bad at stopping A or H pawns. Okay, so he plays f5. The idea is he's sort of saying, oh, take my pawn, I'll take that one, so we've got one each. And then what happens now is he's got this outside pass pawn, which is a lot more dangerous than the pawns that black has in the center. So bishop e8, something like this. The outside pass pawn can advance up the board. The king will look after this one quite easily, but the bishops can support the advance of the h pawn quite well. And you'd have excellent winning chances from this position. White is probably winning, to be honest. It's very hard for this knight to defend both sides of the board at the same time. Of course, Nepo doesn't fall for this. He just says, okay, I'm going to play king g7 and allow you to take here. Because obviously he's got the option now to take back with the king, which defends this pawn, but he more accurately played bishop g4 first. If the bishops get traded off, he'll round up this pawn later. And black might even be winning in this, or better in this case, okay, because he, this pawn contains both of these pawns for white. The h pawn can't move, and therefore black can create a pass pawn in the center by say taking here, and this knight is going to be better than that bishop because it can go to white and black squares. And it's going to be very difficult for white to look after everything. This knight is hopping in, and he will create a pass pawn here potentially. So you have to be careful. You can lose this as white. So white played bishops here, and this retreated, keeping an eye on this pawn on white squares. King d2, and then b4. Basically cements the draw. If we have a look, b4 prevents king c3, and there is no way of the king to get into the position now. Every square is blocked, and then after here, king takes here. There is no way for white to make progress. He can't take this pawn because the knight is defending it. If somehow this bishop gets around to attack this knight, he can even just be defended. And then if white takes, then it's an opposite color bishop endgame, which is completely drawn. These pawns are very nicely from black has made sure that they're on white squares, so they can always be attacked by the bishop. So it's just a complete draw. Yeah, and there's no way of this king getting in. So I think they agreed to draw at this point rather than repeating. So yeah, Gukesh missed a chance. And I think the chance that he missed was very instructive for us. If we go back, then the mistake was he wants to keep rooks on the board. He should keep the rooks on the board because there is a lot more danger for black here. And the plan should always be, if you've got the bishops, stop your opponent from getting squares to put the knight on, gain space, create weaknesses, and then expose them with your bishops that are much better attacking pieces than the knights. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed your video. If you did, like, comment, share, tell your friends, and join me for round 4. Thank you.